We are right at 10:15, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christopher Pauli. I'll be the moderator of this panel. If you guys can't hear anything, just let us know. We can always lean into the microphone more. Today we'll be talking about the legal cultivation of psilocybin, kind of what that's going to be evolving into and how it's regulated. I myself am a research scientist in the genetic space of cannabis, getting more into entheogens and different fungi and entheogenic plants to also study the genetics of those and relate the genes to the chemical information, because that's really the ultimate goal of genetics, is to predict and or kind of customize that chemical profile of a given strain. I'm a co-founder of Trippy Technologies, which we're a genetics and chemistry platform company for all kinds of entheogenic plants. So we're developing genetic tests for them, kind of different pathology tests for them, as well as kind of the microbial and regulatory testing that may come along, and some of the things we'll get into today. So we'll start with Max here, and then just kind of work our way down the line for intros.
All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Maximo Serrato-Sawdey. I'm a graduate from the University of Minnesota, studied plant sciences. And mycology has always kind of been a long-time hobby and interest of mine. So it's just great to be here talking about growing mushrooms with you guys and the future of cubensis and other psychedelics.
My name is Tony Gallo. I'm the managing partner for Sapphire Risk Advisory Group. We're the oldest national security consulting firm in the cannabis industry. In the last 8 years, we have worked in 31 states, built out 61 cannabis facilities, got into this industry less than 6 months ago, working with a client now in Colorado with the DEA on a lab license and a grower to go commercial, and be working with them on, as this industry grows, just like the cannabis industry, designing security for the facilities.
My name is Eli Katz. I'm the founder of the Zwisky Foundation, a nonprofit. Our mission is to fight caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue. So I used to be in enterprise technology. I was the CTO for a national bar and systems integrator. And in 2015, I had to stop doing that. I developed several conditions, pain-related, and that required me to stop traveling. And I really turned to focus on launching whiskey, so to fight caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue. Psychedelics are a very key part of that activity, and we've been advocating in this space since 2017.
Awesome, thank you guys. It looks like it's yeah. So kind of our first question, and we'll just kind of work our way down the line, is what does a legal psilocybin grow look like right now?
That's cool.
If there is so happen to be one, if you were trying to feed into a clinical trial program or any other type of research, what does that grow look like? What type of licenses are needed with that? And that's it. You want to just start with that, Eli? And...
Sure. So to be very clear, there is no such thing as a legal grow at this time. There are no licenses that have been issued, and right now there is no framework for those licenses to be issued. We're in active discussions with the governor's panel, with the mayor's council, to define what that needs to look and feel like. But as far as legal cultivation, everything is underground right now. So.
Eli reminds me that this is the kind of conversation we would have had in 2006 when it came to cannabis, that there's no legal rules there. And look where we are now as an industry in the cannabis industry. I see very much in the psilocybin industry as we continue to look at what regs are out there right now, such as the DEA does have regs, and how the states are going to incorporate that into this growing industry. Very, very similar when it comes to that. You look at the industry now, if you look at, it's not an industry, but what is required. What I was mentioning before when we were talking is I see it very similar to taking a cannabis grow facility, and a cannabis grow facility in a lab had a baby. That's what your facility would look like. very much focused, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that I'm seeing as the industry's growing, what's going to be required.
Was there anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I was actually waiting to hear about legal licensing because obviously it's been around, so I was interested. I didn't know if that was actually a thing or not, but no, I don't have much to add to it.
Awesome, and yeah, so it is a Schedule I drug, and to even have this in a lab in kind of an academic university, you need a Schedule I license, similar to studying LSD or heroin or some of these other really kind of controlled substances. And so it's a very complex process to get that license to even start studying these, and then there's no licensed supplier of them, so once you get the license to have it in a lab, where are you going to get this compound from? And so I know a lot of us see parallels between the cannabis industry and the psilocybin industry. We're just in this nascent stage of decriminalization, allowing it to be talked about. The fact that we're up on a panel here is quite amazing. And one thing that I wonder is kind of what are the main differences between the cannabis industry and the psilocybin industry do you think will happen? We'll start with Max there, just kind of within the kind of decriminalization, medicinal legalization to recreational legalization. We've kind of all seen how that framework's worked out. What do you think are kind of the most shocking similarities and differences between what will happen in psilocybin and what has happened in cannabis?
Well, yeah, I think like we were discussing earlier, there are going to be levels of cultivation, right? So you're going to have small scale cultivations and you're going to have larger scale cultivations. And these regulations are going to differ between kind of your size of operation, whether you're doing it for a personal use, whether you're doing it for a medicinal use or recreational use. We talked about those caregiver models, the caregiver model kind of probably making its way into this industry at some point, and probably being a good model for this industry, seeing as it's the medicinal kind of side of cubensis and psilocybin is starting to come to fruition.
For those who don't know, can you elaborate on what a caregiver model kind of looks like or what it has looked like in cannabis?
Yeah, so you have a grower for a specific patient or a number of patients, and usually the number of patients that you have under your license, under your caregiver's license, allots your amount of harvestable material, or the amount that you can grow, I should say.
Nice, appreciate that. And so you said it's similar to a lab and a commercial cannabis grow kind of put together in one.
Well, if you look about how you grow, one key word that you want to make sure that you understand is contamination. Contamination is the word in this industry, more so than even the cannabis industry would be. You're taking a product that is very susceptible to any kind of disease, virus, pesticide, anything of that nature can immediately destroy that. If you understand the growing of it and how it grows, the one other thing that is going to be a challenge for the states is how are they going to regulate or understand how you're growing that product. If you put cannabis, you put seeds in the ground, there's a metrics about that, X amount of product comes out, they can understand that. If you take mushrooms and you grow them, first of all, it's not a seed. You then flush that bag. If you can flush it 3 times, great. You said 4 times, you're kidding if you have a fourth flush in your bag. But there's no way of understanding how much product came out because nothing went in to produce that product. So the state and cities and the government's going to have to understand that it will be done by weight or so forth. But when you look at this size room, this would be a perfect size for a grow compared to our largest cannabis grow we did was a 450,000 square foot greenhouse in Las Vegas. I don't see the mushroom industry being like that. I see where it's going to be much more financially to the advantage of people to be able to grow this product and be able to sell it, as long as, again, following some of the DEA rules as a guidance, and then that will morph from the state.
Absolutely. The three keywords for this are grow, gather, gift. Those are the contexts in which we were talking with the DA as what is allowed. So you can either grow them in your home, you can grow them for home use, and or technically this isn't your this is a home. So they can be used for personal use. So my nonprofit is a great form of my use. With regards to that concept with a large number of thousands, we are actively looking at partnering with wholesalers of cannabis because we think that there's the hybrid space where there's formulations that require both cannabinoids and psychedelics. And so we encourage folks who are growing cannabis, commit 25% of your space to psychedelics. And if you're doing that, we'll partner with you, we'll work with you best practices all the way through it to make sure that, because that's a huge gift, we're investing so much, let's collaborate and partner with you.
I agree with that. I think that this industry, there'll be two separate distinct industries. There'll be the microdose industry, which will be much more receptive by the government and the state. And then there'll be macrodosing, which I think will have almost nothing to do with microdosing. Clients which may have some crossover where it could be anywhere. I'll make this up. You actually go somewhere and you meet a shaman and you experience this once or two times a year, and you have that experience. But that, I think, is totally different than what's going to be more a pharmaceutical product as microdosing.
So actually, to follow that up, we're working with a group in Oregon right now who's one of the oldest cannabis nonprofits in the country, and helping them design their vertical integration protocols. So that you can walk in for a supervised psilocybin session in 2 years, in 2023. What that also extends to is telemedicine. Because of the fact that if it's available in Portland, it's available in Eugene, it's also available in the hinterlands, out there. But that means that transportation has to be in one place. That means that, so being able to manifest things. And I mean, the compliance platform is required.
So when you're talking about integrating cucurbits or mushroom growers and cannabis growers, are you referring to polycultures, or is that more of like separate spaces within the same facility?
I would say separate spaces in the same facility. We've learned more by doing it. And so having the availability of the facility, being able to tune your grow very quickly, practicing best practices around cleanliness, around sterilization and pasteurization, but also being able to innovate with your laboratory to do that. Oh, you have the aha. This seems like to be a really well there. So you just
We just built a facility in Missouri, which was a cannabis facility with a lab that was attached to it, which, if you obviously you don't need to keep 80% or north of humidity in a mushroom grow facility, which is much different than what you do in cannabis. But I could see that migrating into having a separate unit that would deal with that, and then maybe a processing that takes some of that with wine, whatever.
Definitely makes sense. And so that kind of leads into this next idea of what does the regulatory framework surrounding this look like? We know that there's a lot of sterilization, pasteurization, kind of this cleanliness environment within growing fungi that there's not as much within cannabis. There's a lot of overlap of the issues, though, that there's certain fungal pathogens that can affect cannabis, produce mycotoxins and harm the end user. Similarly, within a fungus growth, we can see those kind of same issues pop up. We'll start with the kind of contaminant side, or just within the kind of making sure we're serving a clean product to the end consumer. What do we think that regulatory framework will look like within kind of testing for a potential mycotoxin coming from another fungi that wasn't the psilocybin producing fungi you wanted to grow? So Max, you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, again, going back to our conversation earlier, there's going to be regulations on, you have to have your batch tested, right? Or you're going to want to have your product tested before you bring it to market to make sure it's clean and it's safe, and you're not going to be harming the end user, especially when the whole point of it is to help your
And within kind of the lab space, do you think there'll be similar regulatory testing to cannabis as like a microbial test would be needed to take your product from your grow and send it to market actually. Is that something you see in kind of that framework?
Well, having been in the cannabis industry now, like I said, for about 8 years, I hope I'm better at testing than it is. You know, I think that that's something that's lacking a lot in the cannabis industry. And I like to see that this industry get in front of that. A lot of my thoughts are, I'm going to be looking at a product that's in a pill form. It may not work, but I think that's the best way of distributing that, that out right now. I would like to be able to see what's in that pill that I'm ingesting. I think a lot of people see a flower in cannabis and then they smoke it and they go, okay, it's a flower, I'm going to smoke it. That's all. But now, if I'm ingesting a pill, I think that there should be more lab testing to say this is what's in the product, much like if you're going to take Tylenol or anything, I'll hold it accountable. You agree?
Very much so. I think COAs, having a COA for mushrooms is going to be the first thing that's required. Not only to be able to provide that capability so that you can actually get them tested fairly easily, quickly, and affordably.
Yeah.
But also that there's, right now, if you've got an implant lab and you're a chemist, you have to have a license to use that facility. It's not available to a home grower, it's not available to a nonprofit, it's not available to those groups. So having one tool evolve, it's kind of best practices. Will really make it viable to get started.
Right. No, I was going to say, you look at the edibles industry in the cannabis market, and you're ingesting something, you want to make sure you understand what you're actually ingesting. So the nice thing about this industry as it continues to grow is there's so many avenues that you can learn from. In 2009, cannabis became legal, and now you have a commercial making money instead of growing in your basement. You have to kind of learn from scratch. Even me from security, if you looked at my security plans in 2009 and my security plans in 2021, and the cannabis facility drastically different. At least here, we can take something and look back a little and say, okay, well, what did our distant cousin, the cannabis industry, do that might facilitate it, make it even better?
That's a really good point. And I think the COA model is something that's going to be definitely needed in psilocybin mushrooms. It's kind of like cannabis. It's a natural product that each different mushroom you have can have a different potency to it. And then also defining what is that potency. With cannabis, it's really easy. It's THC. That's the main compound that gets you high. There are these analogs of THC that can or cannot be psychoactive. And so we're still figuring out what that looks like in the mushroom. Can we kind of just have an open discussion about what do we think is necessary to test for in mushrooms, and kind of what potential problems could we see within missing a compound such as an MAOI mushroom that could potentially interact with other medicines you're on, and it's a compound that these mushrooms can naturally produce.
So the joke in our group is that mushrooms are very similar to people. We both breathe oxygen and exhale, respire carbon dioxide. The joke is that somebody's going to introduce steroids in the mushrooms. And so you might really have to test for, because it's not so much that you're testing, there's no pesticides needed. So you're not testing for contaminants. Somebody could easily supplement their substrate with something in that sense, and form new compounds and we don't know yet. So there needs to be now the ethical code of conduct code that we're able to identify. These are, and as we identify them, put them on a central roster. This is really dangerous.
Yeah, I think going back to the testing, and ethics, I think is huge. I think there just need to be more ethical standards for testing and standards, period, for testing. In the cannabis industry, I know with the edibles a lot of time, I don't know if there is technically a standard test for testing potency. Is there currently?
There's protocols there are published protocols for using HPLC.
Okay, right, just strictly HPLC. Okay. Well, yeah, I think just overall those standardized testing for whatever contaminants or heavy metals.
And it's a really interesting point. Just something we've gained from cannabis is seeing kind of how testing labs differ from state to state, from even just one lab to another in the same state following a very similar protocol. Each piece of analytical equipment you use is different, and so that's something that it's going to be the same issues that we ran into in cannabis, we're going to run into in the psilocybin industry. And so one thing that I hope for is it's not a potency chasing game of saying I just want the highest psilocybin number and that's going to mean I'm the best. Because some of these other compounds like MAOIs, they potentiate these alkaloid compounds. And so that's something we kind of know about, we're learning more about every day. It's a really interesting kind of piece of this puzzle, testing and what's this regulatory framework going to look like. One thing I think you might be able to speak to best, or either do as well, is what is this kind of initial growth going to look like? Is this going to be very similar to cannabis, where it was kind of your basement techniques being brought up on much larger scales? Or is this going to follow more of the gourmet mushroom side of things that there already are large mycology farms already in operation producing portobello mushrooms or other kind of oyster mushrooms, and just gourmet mushrooms that have beneficial effects within themselves? Do you think they'll kind of mimic that model for psilocybin producing mushrooms, or will it be more of kind of everybody has their own techniques, similar to cannabis, where each person's figured out the best way to do this, and there's a million different best ways out there? Which side do you think psilocybin mushrooms will take?
For me, I see that it's going to be gourmet farming. Because that gets you the business and the capital, really, to be able to have the lab.
And I see something like an IPA type of environment, also routine. You know, to grow it it's not hard to grow. It's hard to grow well. Is what I've seen. You know, a couple of tubs, you know, a humidifier, you know, some mycelium, and and you put, you can grow mushroom. Now, can you grow them well? Can you grow them in a commercial environment? Can you process them where you can then distribute and sell them, dry them out, and all that? What happens if the crop becomes contaminated? It's nice like that. I personally, looking at this industry, the DEA already has rules and guidelines. I could see this becoming federally legal quicker than the cannabis industry, because I already see that there is a framework, and this would be more microdosing than macrodosing, and a push for this product to be out there in the public, certain people. I think a lot of it is looking at a medical use, PTSD or something of that nature. It doesn't have that Cheech and Chong label to it. I could see this in the next 5 years surpassing the cannabis industry and being able to ship it across state lines.
Yeah, I was just going to say some of the techniques that are going back to the cultivation, some of the techniques that are being used on small scales are definitely scalable for larger operations, and I think the growers will decide kind of what works best for them during this situation. I would love to see them doing bag production, doing like fruiting chambers with gas, and legally doing bag production of psilocybin. I'm sorry, cubensis. Again, I just think everyone's going to find what works for them ultimately when they're doing their cultivation. And some spaces, mountain tubs might work better than fruiting bags.
And that kind of leads into my next question is, me being a geneticist and plant breeder, I really like breeding and creating new varieties and new compounds. And with mushrooms, there's very large genetic diversity out there already. These things have grown all around the world. There's kind of all these landrace mushrooms out there. Do you guys think those have a spot within a production kind of environment, or is this going to be more of produce the most potent mushroom, extract the psilocybin, and then use just that? Or is there some kind of maybe a craft mushroom market developing within the psilocybin space as we start with all these landrace type isolated genetics and then start cross-interbreeding them to create new kind of proprietary varieties. Next, you want to start with that?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of mirrors the cannabis industry too. We're raving about THC when everyone knows about THC, but now as time goes on, more cannabinoids come out. More interactions with terpenes are going out. So that I think started creating a market for more craft. And getting people back into looking into breeding with land races rather than interbreeding the same variety over and over again, basically with the same results, just slightly different phenotypes.
If you look at the future of this industry, possibly could be microdosing. So at microdosing, you're at 1%, right? 0.25. So at 0.25, I'm achieving what I want to achieve. To have a product that's at 0.8 isn't desirable, unlike the cannabis industry. My desire is to get high, and I'm doing something that's 3% THC, now I can do something that does 30% THC. I might migrate there because I want to get high. But if my desire in this industry, or my desire is to microdose and have a nice effect, at 0.25, I achieve my goal. So I don't know if I really want 0.5. So I don't see a higher strain being as much of a selling point as you do in the cannabis industry.
The one thing I will say that's different now than when cannabis was really developing Reddit. And so the amount of conversation and communication that takes place on Reddit has made, from a genetics perspective, has made this really viable. The education, the learning, the differences that people have learned about cultivation, have learned about technique and strength. And so the open conversation there really is allowing for things to develop at a much more rapid pace.
What I see going into that 925 fungi and the mushroom part of it is what other ingredients are added into that capsule. I think that's where the company's going to distinguish themselves. THCV or THCA or something of that nature. Is there a mixture of a CBD compound or something like that? That's where I see the companies will distinguish themselves. Again, I see microdosing as being the business. 0.25, then you add something, and that's your secret sauce that you're adding to that.
Even like
other
adaptogenic mushrooms.
Yes, and that's what makes you the company that's different than the other company. But I wouldn't want 0.8. I'm not microdosing anymore. It's a whole different world. My day is done.
The perspective has shifted.
Next question. I've heard about microdosing helping with depression, and I've heard a little bit about Parkinson's, which is what I'm most interested in finding out. Do you guys have any knowledge about what's paving the way and what's happening with Parkinson's connection with microdosing?
I've got a couple of Parkinson's clients in my group, and I can say that our microdose formulation is very effective. Not only having stabilized some of the tremor disorder, but also with some of the pain that goes along with it. One of the big benefits of microdosing psilocybin is it makes things less triggering. It takes all of the stuff that we get wound up about on a daily basis, minimum 10 times a day, your hackles go up. And if you can just take all of that and dial it back down. And microdosing is excellent at this. It just takes it, it's not butter off your back, you're just going, okay, I'll deal.
It's like taking a deep breath almost.
Yeah, definitely. And it allows you to go on with your day. If you macrodose, it's not a day product.
So I'd say one thing that you mentioned earlier in our conversation was that it has two different types of psilocybin in it, or basically psilocybin isolated from two different types of mushrooms. And within this entourage effect, we know that psilocybin is not the only thing that's guiding this feeling within like Psilocybe cubensis or other psilocybin producing mushrooms. What would you say kind of are those differences within the the mushrooms themselves? And have you been working to formulate off of that to kind of guide an entourage effect, kind of like what you said of what the other things you add into these microdose blends are really what's going to differentiate you than the potency? The potency is just this kind of standardized dose at this point. What have you noticed when you do just one or psilocybin from one mushroom versus kind of a mixture of mushrooms? Can you just speak to that one?
Sure. A quick question to folks in the audience. If you want to do a bit this, who has first-hand experience of psilocybin? So you guys probably know the strain if you went with Golden Teachers, for example. It's a much different trip and experience than going with Lizard Kings or going with Penis, which is a much stronger, much more intense experience. In our formulations, that's why we went with two. So we have a council, an advisory council, and so we saw input on the strains that we were able to cultivate and that we're currently researching. What do people experience with that? Is it like heavy? Is it intense? Is it body? Is it mind? Is it a combination of it? Is it giggling? You know, there are aspects of it. And so that way we wanted to balance. We wanted to balance, so we can sort of the heavy space and the body space. And that's an ongoing bit of research. The opportunity to meet folks at this conference who are doing the genetics research and we're really pushing the envelope of what they're capable of and keeping that conversation going. And it's also really important that in the community that we work with folks who are known to the community. That there may be all these wonderful underground labs, but if you're not out there seeking purity, getting feedback, then we are not interested in hearing from you. You know, go ahead and earn a place at the table and really show up. This needs people who are above board in this.
I think that's a huge thing within itself to just kind of go from this underground industry that's been such a stigmatized thing for so long to being this above board, this is science backed, this is dosable, we can actually guarantee you the mushroom that you get would be this potency, and that's part of this, how this will be regulated going forward. That's it, question over there?
Yeah, going off of what you were saying, do you think there would be, say, a certain sensitivity placed towards indigenous people who would, pretty much proliferated these medicines throughout time, built into the industry? We don't want to see another kind of pillaging of genetic resources, such as the cannabis industry has created in some areas. Is that a concern for the psilocybin industry as it grows? Working with people who have
The ceremony aspect definitely is key to the industry. And it's also how you meet other leaders in the space. And so everybody that I know that practices ceremony regularly is very respectful of tradition and of people, the folks that are, it leads from psilocybin usually to ayahuasca, DMT. And so having the traditional shamans and the approach to that, but also making sure that those groups who aren't admitted who haven't been monetizing that for a very long time, that some of the money that comes from this goes to preserve those traditions.
That's what I was going to get. The remuneration aspect. It's one thing to pay respect, that's another thing to invest in these people.
Right. And also to hire them.
Exactly.
Wherever you can, work in communities that are disadvantaged. Hire folks from that community to do the work and train them. And seek their feedback. Let them inspire and input into ideas, not just simply put them to work. So, great question.
And so kind of the next thing I'd like to talk about is kind of the difference in the model of cannabis where we have this 30% potency, this plant produces more cannabinoids than we can attest to. With psilocybin, it's not necessarily that same case because we're only producing from the psilocybin cup, we just saw 1 to 3% psilocybin by dry weight of these mushrooms. That's something easily reproducible and attest to with kind of a bioreactor type production model. Where do you guys see that balance? I know we kind of talked about it being more on the pharmaceutical side and more of a microdose. Do you see that being more of a test tube produced psilocybin compound that's going to be then put into these formulations, or will this be something that there will be mycologists farming mushrooms and then extracting these compounds, or using more full spectrum extracts to produce these medicines? Is it going to be kind of that synthetic versus naturally produced kind of debate there as well?
So I strongly believe that currently there is synthetic psilocybin, it's called psilocybin for acetyl which I could use if I wanted to have the same exact thing every time. Yet isn't where we're heading with it because of the fact that it doesn't interrupt the flashing. It doesn't interrupt the nerve transmission that causes the problems. So there's other things in plant medicine. So the entourage effect is very important.
I would say that, you said before, no two petri dishes are the same. Right? And when we look at that, we want to make sure, the product that we're going and how that is going to work in the industry. I don't think synthetic is the way in the future. I think natural is always better, and I think it's picked up a lot of momentum. I think the cannabis industry helped pave that way. I think it is, it's an agricultural product that we're already talking about, made by nature. So people can take synthetics, but in all honesty, I think that it's not going to affect the microdosing industry per se. Do you agree? Or?
Yeah, no, I agree. I personally, just personal thoughts, I would never get my psilocybin from a test tube, so that just wouldn't interest me. And I don't. I think, yeah, the entourage effect again has a huge role in extraction to, isolating the compound, especially isolating it in a synthetic setting, it just doesn't sound right to me. It's
Yeah, I'm kind of directed towards you, your background in horticulture. I was wondering, since we're only getting 1 to 3% of psilocybin out of these mushrooms, what are the secondary, if any, secondary metabolites that are being produced and what, their interaction with the body or what's going on there?
Yeah, so we know about some of these kind of secondary compounds that are associated with psilocybin production, like beta-cysteine, norbaeocystine. Forgive me if my pronunciation is wrong. I've heard them pronounced so many different ways, and I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce them. But there's a lot of these it basically is all the same tryptophan, tryptamine type base molecule that then gets put through this biosynthetic path that will create various alternate chemical structures off of that base chemical structure. Similar to cannabinoids being a CBG derived, like all your THC, CBD, CBC are all from CBG. These are all from tryptamine. And the same with NN-DMT is a tryptamine-based molecule as well. And so we see this whole class of tryptamines, they're all alkaloids as well. And so
Those will be classified as also essential nutrients, seeing as how they have a building block.
And so the tryptophan is an essential, like our primary metabolite in the fungi or most organisms in general, just because you need it for basic protein synthesis. When you get to psilocybin, that's more of a secondary metabolite because it just helps that fungi survive and reproduce. There's no real reason that fungi needs to produce this to survive. So that's how they classify primary versus secondary metabolites. But a lot of these things surrounding psilocybin that are very similar structure, potentially similar effects, aren't regulated. They're not the controlled substance that psilocybin is. So you guys have much to add on top of that? Anything that you'd want to say?
I think I could. Good points.
And so I think I've heard Paul Stamets give a talk at the Telluride Mushroom Festival about breeding for a beta-cysteine dominant mushroom. And that was something that he wants to get into because you can remove psilocybin, basically kind of like a THC-free cannabis plant. You can remove the one regulated compound in the psychoactive mushroom that maybe this thing does the same thing without psilocybin. Maybe you'll get a very similar effect from all these other entourage compounds that it'll be like hemp, that you can smoke hemp, feel an effect of it. It's not the same high as THC, but there is a similar effect there. So that's a great question. I appreciate that.
You guys talk about testing and potency and I haven't really seen a whole lot of testing facilities or licenses advertising test for psilocybin, with the importance of microdosing, which is so many go for microdosing versus macrodosing. What do you guys see as controls sort of testing availability, accuracy, consistency, and that you see as the future accurate dosing.
So the road to heaven is paved with good intention. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. The road to heaven is paved with consistency. Here in Colorado, we don't have any labs that do it yet. I can say that we're probably 6 months to a year away from something. And then that might mostly 3 in a couple years ago. We'll have a dozen, I don't know, 5.
And the client worked with in Colorado is wants to do that testing. And the road that they're taking is getting the blessing. And that could change, but that's the high road, the road less traveled road, you know, which makes sense. I mean, if you're going to start a lab testing for this, you want to make sure that someone's not documented or too low.
And you can guarantee that that facility is pursuing DEA certification because you know it's a perform producing. They're not going to have anywhere near. But you can partner with them.
And I think guidelines will come out, industry guidelines, you know, what would be a normal microdosing experience, basically.
That's a really good point too within the testing capabilities, because within the psilocybin cup we saw that threefold potency difference. So we talked about a 0.25 gram microdose. Is that the 3 times more potent mushrooms or the average strength kind of mushrooms? And so kind of just within the dosing and making an enjoyable experience for everybody, that's something we need to figure out. And we need to be able to have to test potency for anybody who's going to distribute these mushrooms, because otherwise you're just giving somebody something that's like, I don't know exactly what this is going to do to you or how much of the effect that you're going to feel from it. So that consistency in dosing and being able to accurately describe what 0.25 grams looks like on a chemical scale is going to be a huge part of this industry to keep it going.
Very similar to edibles now, you have this
Exactly.
You want to make sure that if you're taking one edible, you get the same experience when you take the second edible in the same bag. If you don't, then, you know,
Yeah, you probably want a warning label.
yeah, that's,
I'd say, and just to finish,
Another question for Maximo. Given your background in plant production and stuff, I was wondering, since mushrooms are already produced now at scale, you know, and I was wondering, is there any difference in psilocybin mushrooms, grocery store bought mushrooms? Could these, say, if I had a store that produces portobellos, could I go for a license and just change what I?
Turn over your operation. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they grow in pretty similar conditions. Most mushrooms, not all mushrooms, but yeah, if you had a huge oyster operation, you could probably easily turn that around into a cubensis overnight. If you had the type of mushroom, yeah, it's a saprophytic mushroom. They're usually easier to cultivate indoors. The substrates are a little easier to work with here versus a mycorrhizal mushroom, which thrives in the soil. That's a lot harder to cultivate indoors, or a parasitic mushroom as well. That's a lot more difficult because then you're dealing with the host. The saprophytics are just easy because you sterilize your substrate, you inoculate the bag, they eat it, and it's pretty much compostable material.
So what about all the exhaled CO2? If they're producing at scale, do you think that could be something that's harmful?
If the CO2 is harvestable?
CO2 that mushroom.
That's an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, again, maybe with the polycultures, you can use that increase in CO2 around your plants, to feed your plants CO2. That might be, something beneficial down the road, or a design idea we could incorporate into it.
And that's an interesting idea to have the kind of separated space within the cannabis cultivators. And that's one thing I see kind of an interesting thing that'll still have to be figured out is kind of within cannabis and alcohol right now you can't have both licenses. But many cannabis cultivators would be the people that would be most apt to grow mushrooms. They're the ones that have been doing it kind of in this black market space for the longest, and that they're more apt to go ahead and do this. So I hope that the licensing of cannabis isn't kind of inhibiting you to go get a psilocybin license or any type of separation of those two industries, because it is natural plant medicines, and that's how we should kind of look at this. You wouldn't tell somebody to grow 6 tomato plants in their backyard, and if they grew 7, you come arrest them. It's kind of just mind-boggling to say I want to regulate a plant in that way, especially when it's a natural medicine. But I think we are at our time now, unless we have one last quick question. Yeah.
Where in the world right now is it easiest to do preclinical or phase 1 studies for psilocybin or mushrooms?
Just repeat the question a little bit.
I'm wondering where in the world, because obviously the U.S. Isn't the best place or easiest place to do clinical studies right now. But for preclinical and clinical studies, if you knew where in the world would be the best place to do that.
Well, actually, this is a great place because MAPS is over Boulder. So this is the Disciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. There's also retreats if you're looking to immerse yourself in this world and really get connected. There's resorts in Jamaica and in the Netherlands. This is really taking place.
South America too. Yeah. South America, Central America. When you look at the cannabis industry, Israel is the leader, that kind of thing. So I could see something like that.
You might be able to find some resources in Amsterdam as well. Amsterdam might be a location if you did.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I know that a few years ago I went to Realization Center in Mexico, in Cancun, there was an IV treatment center. I'm wondering, I guess based off this question, is it different to say that it is legal and that it can actually, I guess, consume and utilize psychedelics versus being able to do studies and being able to develop out of that? Because he's asking for keto and seeing these people like, right? Whereas I already went to a place where you could get IBD treatment. Is that different? Is that a different category of commission versus like what you need or make sense?
Yeah, I think they're two kind of separate things. One is trying to go for the FDA approval or like the European version of the FDA approval, versus just allowing that treatment to happen without any approval or kind of regulatory framework surrounding that. But I wish we could answer everyone's questions. We'll be around the conference all day, so feel free to approach any of us. I want to thank you all for